Welcome to Planet Vero Radio, and our host today is John Bona.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live. Die. Fight, and you may die. Run, and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Well, good evening to the story of liberty, and that is a clip, of course, from Braveheart. I'm John Bona, your host, and with me this evening is Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. Say hello, guys.
Good evening, John.
Hi, John. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you. And that seems, as back then, to be the same question of ultimate power in a nation. And one of the most basic issues regarding any system of government, of course, is that question: who will have ultimate power and control of a nation, and as it relates to America? Well, when the United States was founded, it answered that question with a different kind of solution. Because the highest authority in this great nation would not be any human person at all, but rather a document, the Constitution of the United States. In fact, one of our founders, John Adams, said that our Constitution was only for a moral and righteous people. He said that it would be wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. Think about that. And now we clearly see those in power saying our Constitution is outdated. It's not fit for the 21st century. Why is it not fit for the 21st century? What about virtue? Is that not fit for the 21st century? Or the natural rights of an unborn child not fit for the 21st century? Or the God-ordained family, as we talked about last week, not fit for the 21st century? You know, it's interesting that our nation, in this way, was founded upon a rule of law as opposed to a rule of men. And Thomas Jefferson said it very, very clearly when he realized that a system of government designed by our founders, including himself, prohibited any one person, or a group of persons for that matter, from gaining ultimate power. And so they made everyone subject to the Constitution. And that's why he said, bind the tyrants to the chains of the Constitution. So you guys know this. And the obvious question is, how important is it for America at this time or any time to adhere to its Constitution?
Well, you know, I could reverse that a little bit, John. This is Dan speaking here, and say or ask, well, what is it then we think we're trying to embrace today if we're rejecting the code, the law code that this nation was built upon? It sounds to me then we are rejecting the rule of law and wanting to embrace some type of an individual rule of each and every man unto himself. And that, in fact, will not build a strong and stable civil society. And that's something that we can reasonably observe by just looking at the nature of America's development over the years. There really never has been a nation that has accomplished what this nation has accomplished. And then we have to ask ourselves what type of rule of law and what was the source that constructed that rule of law. Marshall, what do you think?
Well, that's right. It's a matter of not just the document itself, because it's being reinterpreted on the basis of relativism, that it really is whatever men think it is, or what it's become is whatever 9 members of a Supreme Court determined to change it to be. It wasn't until the 20th century, after Christopher Columbus Langdon had become the president of Harvard Law School in the 1870s, and then other justices came along in the Supreme Court and began to interpret in an evolutionary way the Constitution, as evolution began to grow as a biological theory. The same thing happened with law. So what we have by the middle of the 20th century is we have a reinterpretation of the document. So unless the people themselves understand a higher law, understand where our laws came from, English common law, English Bill of Rights, Magna Carta, Mayflower Compact, these were all biblically based documents based on centuries of fighting for and believing in and understanding the biblical principles of law and government that brought about the finest, freest nation the world that ever was. And what we're doing in the middle of the 20th century, back around 1950, 1960, we began to completely ignore those foundations and try to establish really a new democracy based upon the rule of the majority, basically one man, one vote, and whatever people think. 51% of people say kill the blondes, let's kill the blondes. There's no basis of law if you lose the concept of higher law, which developed out of England and Scotland for 700 years.
I think it's also interesting to note here that when the Hebrew Constitution, if you will, that law that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, it contained a provision that when Israel came into the promised land, that it should be submitted to the people and formally accepted by them. And they were to be assembled in this amphitheater-type formation with these 2 mountains, Baal, a bleak, barren rock on one side, and Gerizim, towering up on the other side that was covered with, beauty. And Gerizim was this prophetic monument of the prosperity, the blessing, the happiness, the loveliness that would follow the observant of the Mosaic institutions, the laws, the 10 Commandments. And Ebal was a prophetic monument of desolation and pestilence, which a disregard of the laws of God, the Constitution, would inevitably bring upon the nation of Israel. And at the appointed time, these tribes of Israel are assembled between these 2 mountains to listen to the provisions of the Constitution. And they were to signify their acceptance of it as an act of free choice. And it was binding upon them and their children forever. It's interesting that it was laid out there right in front of them, so obvious. Pick God's law, choose to live under his law, and here's the good things that'll happen. The liberty, the freedom, the prosperity, the blessing. You don't follow my law, and here's the things that'll happen. And God showed it real clear. It was real obvious. To me, the relationship, the fundamental principles, I think, are almost identical between that Hebrew Constitution, the details of that organization, that system of self-government. Public opinion was a powerful element. Marshall, I wonder if Moses appeared during a session of Congress today, what would he say?
Well, unfortunately, most of the members of Congress are neither students of the Constitution or students of the Bible, which they should be, because the Bible is the foundation for the Constitution, exactly what you were saying, John. And in early America, one historian, famous historian, I believe it was Perry from Harvard, said in his study of early America, he said the Old Testament was like the air they breathed. They had over 7 million sermons given to them between 1620 and 1776, and during that time, the people of America understood the Old Testament and understood the law and the grace that was involved and the beauty of obeying it. And the result is that the people themselves then developed a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution based upon the Hebrew Republic. What you were just describing is the only other successful republic in the history of the world. And your listeners, just to comprehend that for 400 years under the judges, there was, to an extent, a successful society in ancient Israel based upon common law, really, the foundation that all men are created equal, the foundation of men give their assent to governmental activity, and the king was under the law, the king was not over the law. Every other government in the history of mankind has had the king or the ruler or the government over the top of the law with other laws separate from the people. But God says, no, all men are equal, and that is the foundation of the American form of or system of government, which is a biblically based system, and you must have a people that understands that if the system is going to be maintained.
Dan go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was just going to comment, even if you read the Mayflower Compact, you will see thousands of years of theology poured into this little group of people. And even in the Mayflower Compact, remember what they're saying, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most necessary and convenient for the general good of the colony. The Pilgrims are acknowledging that King James is the king, but they're saying we're going to establish such just laws and constitutions as necessary to properly govern. They're not necessarily going to him for permission to produce these just laws. They are acknowledging this Magna Carta statement that we can do that because there is a covenant relationship between the God, the king, and the people. And that's why when we come to 1776 and we see the Declaration of Independence stating that there's a duty for good men, just men to stand up and say, no, king, you've broken the covenant, it's already established all the way back through into the Mayflower Compact, which works its way all the way back to Exodus when Moses on Exodus 19 is saying, okay, now choose. You choose this day, this covenant with its obligations and its privileges and certain defined relationships. And so when they declare independence in 1776, all these men are simply reacting to thousands of years of a republic way of thinking and a covenant style of thinking, which is very foreign to us today. That the king is not somehow set above everything, nor is the federal government set above everything. There are constraints, and the people choose who this day they will follow.
Well, that's great. And, Romans 13:1 says, and we'll pick up here in a minute on that, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And I think many pastors have this out of context because I've heard them preach on this. In the system of government established in America, the highest authority is not a person, it's a document, the Constitution of the United States. So when a person swears an oath to office to protect and guard the Constitution, that's what he's supposed to do. And we're going to come back here in a minute with the story of liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. I'm here with Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson.
Hi, John.
Hello. We left off talking about the responsibility of pastors to preach the entire gospel. And, of course, Christ said in Matthew 28:19 and 20, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. That phrase, all that I have commanded you, means more than just say John 3:16. As wonderful as John 3:16 is, that verse, that God gave his only Son, that whoever so believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. All that Jesus commanded is everything that he taught and recorded in the four Gospels and the entire Bible for that matter. And I always appreciated an analogy that my old pastor, D. James, used to say, and he used the analogy that the Christian life should be compared to a hurricane. Now, here in Florida, we have had quite a few hurricanes. In fact, two of them hammered Vero Beach in 2004, Francis and Jean. But first, he said it's that calm, still, warm center. And second, there are those swirling winds that roar around that center. And he said in our spiritual life, if we're going to be a hurricane, we need those two elements, that warm, calm center, which is our private life with Christ, our devotion to serve him, live for him, and that is what fuels the power of the hurricane. But he said something must come out of that. Christians must be engaged in the cities, in the towns, potent, able to do good. And I don't know, you, Marshall, you're in California. Dan, you're up in Minnesota. I think the majority of evangelical churches that I've seen and visited in a sense become pietistic. Not that piety is good, devotion to Christian religion, for example, but piety in itself is not, because it makes the church impotent. For example, they never engage politics. How do you feel about that, Marshall?
Well, exactly. There's a fear. As an ordained minister myself, for almost 40 years and preaching in churches all over America, I find that there is a fear, and the fear has come with this 501c3 status and the idea that somehow the government sanctions the church to say what it's supposed to say, and churches are told not to preach politics from the pulpit, quote, even though there's nothing in the Constitution or nothing even in the laws of the IRS to keep people from preaching the truth from the pulpit about any issue, including government and politics. Most people shy away now, especially those in the pulpit, from involvement. But I think the reason is not just that. The reason becomes a theological reason, that we have failed to understand that passages like Romans 13 do not teach abject submission to government and the forgetting of all of our societal obligations for the purpose of doing spiritual things, but that in reality a believer should be taking the truths of God and applying them in love to all of his society. And that includes civil government. That involved with not only how you vote and representatives, that and you might even be one yourself, and that those representatives are all accountable to God. Romans 13 says that a civil servant is a minister of God. It's not saying that he's not. In fact, he's not over you in a way that you must obey him no matter what. No, he has someone.
Hello?
Well, hey, I think we, for some reason, had lost Dr. Foster there.
Yep, I think he clicked his phone off by accident. John, are you there?
I am here. That's okay.
Well, I will follow up on his thoughts. I think Marshall is tapping on that whole concept that we have a responsibility to be engaged in all areas of life, bringing our biblical view to all of those areas. But I would challenge people to realize that if we're already fearful, shall we say, on the corporate scale, we are probably already fearful on the individual or family level to incorporate those same biblical principles. And that's why when you talk about having dominion for every area, I think it has to start in your own home at your own kitchen table, that you as a whole family, in how you educate your children, how you build economy in your home, how you embrace a work ethic in your home, how you raise your children, those are all areas where God has sovereignty. And I think it starts there. And if you've surrendered in that area of life, it's very easy to keep surrendering. It's this slow trickling down until pretty soon the floor has fallen beneath, and then you're standing in the abyss, and it's very, very difficult to turn that around. And I think that's where the problem begins. when a family does not really understand that God has dominion over all of their family operations, even our homeschool. We put that before God every year. It's His homeschool. It's not ours. And we become smarter about that every year as to what is education supposed to be and supposed to accomplish versus what does the system tell us it should accomplish. And you end up with different results. And you have to be okay with those results because one, you're trying to obey God, and one, you're trying to obey man.
Well, and that is the good news of the gospel, that it will result in changed lives. And Christ wants that to result in changed families, as you just talked about, Dan. And when the gospel changes lives, it'll result in changed neighborhoods,
Yep.
changed schools, homeschool or private schools, public school, and changed businesses, and ultimately changed societies. So the question I have is, shouldn't the gospel also result in changed governments as well? And we were talking about how the Holy Scriptures support Christian influence in government. The Old Testament shows many examples, just to name a few, of how the Bible supports believers in God who exercised influence in their different secular governments in history. One that I think of, Marshall, is the Jewish prophet Daniel, who, as you read that book, he had strong influence on the secular government in Babylon when Israel was carried away. Daniel boldly told the king, "Break away from your sins and practice righteousness. Your inequities are obvious. Show mercy to the oppressed." Daniel, I think, is an Old Testament example of a believer exercising significant influence on civil government. And, of course, this one ruled by a pagan king at that. And others, other believers in God had high positions and influence. Joseph, as we read, was the highest official after Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he had great influence on the decisions of the Pharaoh. Later we see Moses, who boldly stood before the Pharaoh and demanded freedom for the people of Israel. And it goes on and on. Nehemiah. Queen Esther is also a great example of a godly woman, a virtuous woman who had great influence on the decisions of the king. The Bible it's obvious. It shows us over and over that several religious people influence secular government. Now, you guys, doesn't this strike right at the core of how many people have twisted that separation of church and state phrase and made it into a bogus phrase? Doesn't this strike right at the core of that argument?
Well, absolutely, and all the way through the Old Testament and the New, and all the way to the cultural mandate to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. I mean, we are about that job. Now, the Christian people of the world, now, because there's so much historical lies out there about, the Crusades and the witch hunts, and so you've got all these people thinking that true Christianity is going to come down on their heads. In reality, it was the Christian people, beginning with Patrick of Ireland in the 4th century, that brought about liberty for Ireland and the end of human sacrifice and the end of slavery. It was the first nation to ever eliminate slavery, and it was under Patrick, under the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments became the foundation for Alfred the Great of English common law in the 8th century in England, 9th century in England. The same was true of Magna Carta, written by a Christian pastor to limit the power of the king. This was true in 1215 at Magna Carta, the most important political document in history. And from there through the Sankuhar Declaration in Scotland, which declared that the king had no right to kill the people and educate the people, and that they were going to educate under God. All of these people and all of these great documents of liberty that resulted, including the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration, were written by Christian people, mostly pastors, who then went on to apply those principles so that all people might be free. And that came true especially in America, where we have complete religious freedom, where we have the ability to make our positions known, not by force, but by the force of our character and our truth. Biblical Christianity, worked out in civil government, results in liberty for all people. And that's the way that's the true history. But that history is not told. It's been distorted in the last 50 years to sound like it's exactly the opposite. So a lot of people are saying, we don't want those people involved because they're going to take away our liberty. No, the very foundation of America's future blessing is going to be whether or not we go back to the founding principles of this country, which were Christian principles.
And those Christian principles actually go all the way back to even Augustine's writing, the first kind of a reformation that may have actually happened in the church. His writings helped set up the doctrine that constructs the early church that sent men like Patrick and Boniface out to bring the gospel to people that had limited rule of law. And even the Inquisitions that are often beat around in the secular world were initially put forward to try to create some rule of law in an anarchist culture. And although some of it got abused, obviously, initially the Inquisitors' job was to go around and make sure mob rule didn't occur. And that was their initial job in France. I think there were 9 Inquisitors at one time in all of France. So there's these distortions that, Marshall, you covered so well. But this march of biblical basis for building government has actually begun since Christ walked the earth and has been progressing steadily, man rejecting it at times, as we talked earlier, that there's a responsibility on our part as families to accept or reject, because that needs to happen. A family needs to have castle doctrine, its own sovereign entity, that if it does not like the king, it has the right to be able to say, no, we're not obliged to these behaviors or these laws because they're immoral and the king has breached the covenant between the king and the people. We see that when the 11 tribes to the north break away from Judah. They had the right to say no. And that's because government doesn't come from the top down in the sense that the king is everything. It really, God works in the hearts of men and brings it from the bottom up. So that's why all reformations, all these great things, happen from quiet, really insignificant from the world's perspective, people, individuals. I mean, I'm guessing that Calvin and Zwingli and these guys were kind of insignificant in the bigger politics of the world with the Islamic invasion coming into Vienna. All this stuff is going on. I'm guessing they were very insignificant issues from the world's perspective, and yet that's where these ideas began to cook and incubate to bring forth a reformation and a change. Exactly,
and I as you said, significant Christian influence can be traced back to these documents, the Magna Carta, of course, our Declaration, our own Constitution. And it led this Christian influence was good because it led to the abolition of evils, gladiatorial contests, human sacrifice, polygamy, the burning alive of widows. I've heard you tell that story, Marshall. Slavery, as well as granting property rights, voting rights, and other protections for women. But and recently we've seen tens of thousands of committed Christians have formed this backbone of the pro-life movement. It's basically Christian that continues to work for the prohibition of abortion in the United States. But then we hear the other side saying, well, you can't legislate morality. How would you answer that, Marshall?
You can't legislate morality. Is that a silly statement? Every time a legislator makes a law, every time he comes down on us with taxation or or takes away the rights of the unborn and 51 or 53 million babies die over a period of 30 years because he passes a law or because a judge determines a decision, that is a moral decision, that is absolutely enforcing a moral law. The thing to remember is that those that are atheistic, for example, the founder of modern atheism was none other than Nietzsche, and Nietzsche said, I hate to admit this, just to paraphrase him, I hate to admit this, but Christianity is the only foundation for individual rights or for equal rights. And he says, without it, we're simply cockroaches on the highway of life. And so even an atheist, the founder of modern atheism, of course, had to admit that the foundation for rights that are unchanging, the rights for the minority, the rights for the unborn, the rights for women and children, those rights all come from a sovereign God with a law that is just and yet merciful. And you won't find that in other nations built on other religions. You just won't find it. And that's the truth of history.
Even Voltaire said he'd just as soon have all his servants be Christians because they wouldn't, rob him blind, right? So all these atheists or secular thinking people all understand the truth of true civil government is going to come from a moral code or a law that's based on something higher than man. And that in fact is the whole story. The minute man is in charge, as we saw through medieval Europe, it was, I have 6 guys, you have 3, I can take more than you do. That was one of the first things that the men like Patrick and Boniface had to convince these barbaric kings to stop doing, just simply seizing plunder principle. As Frederick Bastiat even says in his book, The Law, the plunder principle, I get 8 guys, we agree against your 7 guys to take your car. And we just take it by force of law, not by rule of law.
Exactly.
All of the principles that our Constitution is built on, John, are biblically based principles. The principle of representation, the principles of the separation of powers. All of these are built upon a view of the sin nature of man. We can't trust any man in power. And so we have to divide things up. Everything comes back down to the local level. And I think it's important for your listeners to understand that we're not talking about the elimination of liberty, but the preservation of liberty here, in that the way in which a biblically based society, especially America, was founded, which is the ultimate example of a biblically based society, was it was built upon localism, where the decisions, and that's what our Constitution talks about, all decisions go back to the states and the people thereof, and the purpose of the Constitution was to limit the power of what John F. Kennedy called the Leviathan. The Leviathan State, the government at the top down, will always become tyrannical. Your listeners right now, I'm sure, are experiencing the tyranny of the federal government in terms of an invasion of their personal rights from the top down, because that's what always happens in any nation where the power tends to always go to the top. And once it goes to the top, it never comes back, because those people will never let go of it unless there is a structure to change it, and unless the people themselves demand and live out at their local community, beginning with their families, these principles of loving your neighbor as yourself, adopting the people that are in trouble, like children that don't have parents, feeding the poor, caring for the needy. This should be done by the church. This should be done by individuals and through individual charities. It should not be done by the government. But as long as we depend upon the Leviathan State to take care of all the responsibilities, we deserve a tyrant, and that's what we're going to get.
That's a scary thought.
Go back and do it God's way, living it out in love. And I believe the people of America, most of them know this in their hearts. They know that it's only going to be loving their neighbor themselves that's going to save our society. And that's what we need to do.
Well, that is the true good of any city, isn't it? That that the government laws and policies that we do have, that they're consistent with God's teaching in the Bible, and that they're not contrary to the Bible's teaching. And this bears witness to the moral standards that we have in the Scripture that will hold all people accountable, including those who work in public office. We have recently seen larger losses of liberty forced upon the people without their consent. For example, health care. And, what I've come to realize is that the government is never an efficient provider of economic goods or services for one main reason. It doesn't have to compete in the free market. So it just kind of veils out there. Russ Walton put it right. He said government is not a producer. It's a taker and a spender. Every dollar spent by the government is a dollar taken from the private sector, from the workers, from the investors. Every dollar taken by the government cannot be spent or invested by that productive, efficient private sector business. Now, the Bible in the book of Acts, chapter 4, does not teach socialism. And many pastors have this wrong. What the early Christian did was voluntary. They gave from their hearts. And when they did give it, the land and the money, as we see in Acts chapter 4, it was under their control to do it. And the other big thing here is they also gave to the church, not the state. And because socialism is in itself an atheistic, it never teaches to give money to the state. Look, at all socialism is involuntary. It's enforced by the government. It operates with the sword of the state, as Marshall said earlier. Socialism has had disastrous effects everywhere it's ever existed on the planet. Socialism simply will not work in this world, and especially in America. Now, unfortunately, America is abandoning capitalism to a degree and moving towards socialism. And so the question I have for you guys is, how much restriction of liberty is really necessary for the government to carry out legitimate functions of government? Go ahead, Marsh.
Well, let me give you an illustration. I just got a call last night from a party chairman in a state of one of the parties. It was Republican Party, and they simply said, "Listen, the people in our county want to really bring down the size of government." And I said, "Well, you can't do that unless we have people who will care for the needs of others and take over the responsibilities that the government should not be doing. And we need to go back to the Constitution and live it out. And then the Leviathan State will shrink." But just to simply say, stop doing things that the government is doing is not going to make it in America, because we can't just stop taking care of people. We can't just stop doing what the government does. We just need to do it at the local level and do it through the private sector, which is always, it's constitutional, it's biblical, it is the only way that it ever works. If we continue down this path, we will lose our liberty. And he said, "We want that for all the people of our district. Please, can we train our people?" I said, "It has to be a heartfelt, voluntary thing, and it's got to be a grassroots movement of people who don't just say, 'Heck no, we won't go, give us our money back.' No, we need to live out through our own giving, our own sharing at the local level, and then demand that the government stop doing what it's doing, because it's totally unconstitutional, as you know, to steal someone's property. The graduated income tax is nothing more than having a bunch of people, when you really get down to it, who don't have the guts to put a gun to his neighbor's head who has a bigger house than he does and steal his wealth. He gets the government to do it for him. In the Old Testament, they used to call that theft. In the 20th century, we call it the graduated income tax. But it's simply stealing from people their property, because you don't have the guts to do it yourself.
You know, Dan,
so we've got to have a people that come to the realization that property rights are sacrosanct, that you can't steal other people's wealth. But at the same time, we can't be self-centered worshipers of granite countertops who care for themselves and don't care for the needs of others. We've got to go back to what we did in America. Until 1960, there was no welfare state. Until 1960, there was no federal involvement in all of these things that now result in 3/4 of the federal budget that is driving us into bankruptcy. How do we get rid of that? We get rid of that by doing all those functions ourselves and telling the government to go away.
I know, Dan, you and I have talked about that, you know, when our government at any level federal, state, county, local, takes more and more of our money or our property, and there's more regulation and control upon these things, that ultimately our liberty is forfeited. And look, we all know this, and it's not a left-right issue, I don't think. It's everybody knows the government is notorious for waste and inefficiency. Billions wasted on bogus programs. And just look at the good that happens when taxes are lowered. Businesses invest more, they grow, they provide more jobs. Ronald Reagan knew this. It actually results in lower prices. Individuals, the other side of it is individuals and businesses earn higher incomes. And even if those incomes are taxed at lower rates, more money still flows into the government coffers because people are paying taxes on so much more income. And Dan, I know you understand this concept.
Absolutely. You know, I always kind of go back to what did we deal with before and what do we have today? Marshall hit the praxis so well as to you just can't shut the water faucet off because you have people out there that have now a contract to be taken care of, and that's our fault for allowing that to happen. But at the same time, we can't be standing out the end of our driveway with our sword in hand trying to protect our property all day long because 7 barbarians are going to show up and try to take our tomato plants. That's why government had a job to protect our lives, liberty, pursuit of happiness, to make it so that there was an overall protection, and then we could go about the industrious nature of producing things. Government was never intended to produce anything except security, and that's why our founders limited to general protection under the law, general maintenance of the law, and once in a while the government could engage in a big general project to build a dam or a bridge that benefited many, many people, and they did not pay for the whole thing. But we see it every day in business. We have government stepping in and telling us everything that we can and can't do with a piece of private property. And the sad part is, and it's an analogy I had at the business I manage right now, I had an employee one day ask me, you know, maybe we should have more women managing the budgets of Congress because many women manage their home budgets. And it was a very interesting observation, except I asked her, I said, but don't we have more women today than we've ever had in Congress? And she looked at me puzzled. And I said, the difference is it's not their money. All
right, we're going to wind up with the story of liberty. Thank you, welcome. And we'll see you next week, next Monday night at 6 p.m.